Okay, so we finished with Chapter 3, and we're ready to move on to a new unit. Unit 2 is titled Heredity and Evolution. So, we're going to start with Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is Heredity. Heredity is the passage of traits from one generation to the next. So, in this chapter, this week, we're going to do things a little differently. In the video, I will explain each of the objectives, and then in class, you guys can work in groups on one of the objectives specifically. So hopefully you can use this video to help with the objective that you are assigned in class. Objective number 1. Compare and contrast the ideas, heredity and traits. Okay, so section 1 is about Mendel and his peas, but in this section we are introduced to the idea of heredity, the passing of traits from parent to offspring. So heredity is a concept or an idea that certain traits are passed on. So the traits that one organism has are given to it by its parents, which were then given to the parents by the grandparents, and so on. So this is a concept. Traits can be thought of as characteristics also. A characteristic is a feature that has different forms in a population. So a characteristic could be hair color, eye color, and so on. Now, these are called traits because they could be different. This is an important concept. A characteristic is a feature that has different forms in a population. So hair color could be brown, black, red, blonde. Those are all characteristics because the color of hair could manifest in any of those ways. However, having hair is not a characteristic because all humans have hair. We are mammals. So it isn't any feature that an organism has, but rather it is any feature an organism has that can be different within a population. This is important. Now that we understand the difference between heredity and traits, we can begin to look at the process that Gregor Mendel used to discover the principles of this concept. Objective 2. Simulate the experiment that Mendel used to describe heredity. Gregor Mendel was born in Austria and grew up on a farm. At his farm, he learned a lot about flowers and fruit trees because they were an important part of the farm. When he was 21, he entered a monastery. The monks taught science and performed many scientific experiments, which was common in Europe at the time. From there, Mendel was sent to Vienna to receive training and teaching, but he didn't really like the schools, so he returned to the monastery where he focused his efforts on experiments with plants. So, from working with his plants, he knew patterns of inheritance were not always perfectly clear. That is to say that one generation did not always have exactly the same traits as the previous generation. And he wanted to find out why that was. So to keep his investigation simple, he decided to study only one kind of organism. Because he had studied garden pea plants before, they seemed like a good choice. Now, in the last chapter, we saw how flowers reproduce, and peas have flowers also. So we recognize all of the parts that we saw before, the stigma, pollen, anther, petal, ovary, ovule, with the bee that pollinates it. We see that this is a typical instance of flower reproduction. Pea plants can self-pollinate, and they have told you that the reason we need pollinators is because most flowers cannot self-pollinate. However, pea plants can self-pollinate, but they don't have to self-pollinate. They also can cross-pollinate. So, here we have self-pollinating and cross-pollinating. These two concepts are important. Self-pollinating means that the pollen from one flower can fertilize its own ovule. Cross-pollinating means that a pollen needs to come from a different flower to fertilize that ovule. Now, the fact that the pea plant fits both of these criteria was important to Mendel. As we saw, Mendel noticed that the pea plants had different characteristics, or traits. The seeds sometimes were round, sometimes were wrinkled. The height of the plant sometimes was tall, sometimes was short. And the colors of the flowers also sometimes were purple and sometimes were white. So what Mendel did was he carefully matched the true breeding plants for each of the traits he was studying. By doing so, he would know what to expect if his plants were to self-pollinate. He decided to find out what happened if he bred or crossed two plants that had different traits of a single characteristic. To be sure the plants cross-pollinated, he removed the anthers of one plant. So, he set up an experiment that took two plants with different traits, we'll say a purple and a white flower, removed their anthers so they could not self-pollinate, put them together, and then he observed the characteristics or the traits of the offspring of those. And he did this over and over again to get a kind of statistical significance on the rate or the occurrence at which these traits were passed on to offspring. So in Mendel's first experiment, he crossed the purple and the white flower. In the first generation, all of the flowers were purple. Now that is a little surprising because intuitively you would think that half of them would be purple, half of them would be white. But then he let one of these purple plants, purple flowered pea plants, he let it self-pollinate. That means that its genetic information is all internal. So because it's purple and it is self-pollinating, it would also be intuitive to think that it would make all purple offspring. However, it made 3 purple offspring and 1 white offspring. This is where Mendel realized the principles of inheritance, because when the white and the purple were mixed, their DNA combined, but the purple was the dominant trait and white was the recessive. So with an even amount of purple and white DNA, purple won out. However, the white DNA is still in there. Just because you can't see it, the genetic material that would have made the flower white is still in there. So that when it self-pollinates again, the mixing DNA has enough of the white part in it to make one of the 4 white. From this, Mendel was able to predict how inheritance would work and how passing on traits would work. He also discovered the concept of dominant trait and recessive trait. Dominant, as I said, is if there's an even amount of each trait, the dominant trait will manifest. The recessive trait will not manifest. From this discovery, human beings became a lot better at selectively breeding things, and many of the foods that we eat and the pets that we have are a result of this process. Which leads us to objective number 3. Explain the difference between dominant and recessive traits. As stated before, the difference between dominant and recessive traits are which ones appear more often in a population. The dominant trait appears more often, while the recessive trait fades into the background. To recede means to go away or back off. So, as stated before, what this means is that when 2 plants or 2 parents with different traits are combined, we will get a 1-to-1 ratio. In a 1-to-1 ratio, the dominant wins. But now this plant does not have purple DNA. it has half purple, half white DNA. It just manifests purple. So that when you mix, when it self-pollinates and you mix half purple and half white with half purple and half white, you get one that is both purple, one that is half purple and half white, another that is half purple and half white, and then one that is white and white. And that's what we see here. This one is purple and purple, so it's purple. This one is purple and white, so it's purple. This one is purple and white, so it is purple. And this one is white and white, so it is white. Mendel carried out these experiments for many different traits that he found in the peas, and he made this table. Purple to white, seed color, yellow to green, seed shape, pod color, pod shape, flower position, and height. And he got these numbers. So, with a calculator, we can find the ratio. The ratio is done for purple to white by dividing purple by white. We get a number that is around 3.15. So, that means that for every 3.5 purple, there is one white. If you do the calculation for all of these, you will find a ratio similarly around 3 to 1. And if we go back to the previous page, we will see that this also held true with the purple and white flowers. 3 dominant to 1 recessive. And that is more or less the ratio that we find in all populations for traits that are passed on generation to generation.